Healthy discussion around issues was the backbone of our democracy. But today, 75% of Americans believe the lack of civility has reached a crisis level. We don't need facts to prove this. We see it and we feel it everywhere, in our streets, in our news feeds, and even in the workplace. It seems every issue is a hot topic, whether that's women's rights, race, the environment, or even healthcare. And we're politically profiled before we even speak, judged based on our gender, our age, and the color of our skin. And we lack the tools and the places to have these kinds of difficult conversations. And that means that we've stopped having them. We risk losing our friendships and even our jobs. So we've stopped talking, and that's bad. Not only because it's tearing our country apart, but it's tearing apart our families. Last year, January 25th, a few days after the president's inauguration, I was angry. And I posted this on Facebook. After posting this, within an hour, it got over 400 comments and spread quickly through my network, and even my mom and my dad saw it. I knew it was a mistake, and I deleted it, but the damage had already been done. It turns out my aunt, my uncle, my only living grandmother, and even my dad defriended me that day on Facebook. It was in this moment that I realized we had to do something. I didn't want to lose my family. So I had to turn for inspiration in where I live, which is the home of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Atlanta. And I live just 6 blocks from where he was born. And you can't walk very far without running into one of his quotes. And the one that I love the most that struck to my core was this. He said, "I'm convinced that men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they don't communicate with one another, and they don't communicate because they are separated from one another." Dr. King understood that what keeps us fearing one another is the fact that we aren't talking to one another. And no one I've seen so far demonstrated this better than Daryl Davis, a Black musician who befriended the KKK, actually the grand wizard of the KKK. And over the course of those years of his relationship, the grand wizard of the KKK and 200 other Klansmen gave up their robes because they could no longer hate Black people, simply because Daryl took the time and effort to get to know them and allow them to share their perspectives. Daryl didn't have to agree with the Klansmen. He didn't have to condone their efforts or even their actions. He just had to allow them a chance to speak their mind and share their perspectives. So if a Black man and the leader of the KKK can be friends, can Democrats and Republicans get along? For the sake of democracy and progress, I sure hope so. But first, we have to ask this question. How did we get so divided in the first place? One reason is because we are separated. We live in bubbles. Pew Research tells us that we're less likely to be friends with people who look differently or think differently than us. And we're selectively segregated, meaning our children are growing up in less diverse schools. And politically, we're more polarized than ever before. And social media doesn't help. The Google and Facebook algorithms of today reflect back our own existing worldviews, meaning that we believe everyone agrees with us. Secondly, we've lost the art of conversation. We don't know how to have difficult conversations. And in fact, many of us grew up around a dinner table that was encouraged to avoid difficult conversations around politics and religion. And that's led us to a lack of understanding of politics and religion. Instead, we should have been taught how to have civil conversations around difficult topics. And we can do this by having maybe less emphasis on debate and more emphasis on nonviolent communication methods, like what's taught at the King Center or the Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence. And third, we don't have dedicated space or time or place to have difficult conversations. You know, we all hopefully know by now that social media is not the place to start a civil conversation. So if we live in bubbles and we don't know how to have conversations, difficult conversations, and we don't have a place to have these conversations, how on earth will we restore civility? Well, I struggled with this, and it reminded me of the same pit in my stomach that I felt years ago in Atlanta, Georgia. In 2013, we had failed to pass a TSPLOS, a transportation referendum, a penny sales tax that promised to unclog our roadways. I don't know if many people have been to Atlanta, but we have some traffic. And we thought this would be our savior, but it failed miserably. The headlines were doom and gloom for Atlanta, and frustrated friends threatened to leave. Sound familiar? So back in 2013, a few of my friends decided to launch a social experiment, and we launched a dinner party project. And it was all about what we love about Atlanta. We launched a website, a toolkit, and 3 big questions. What's your favorite secret spot? What do you love about Atlanta? And what would you love to love about Atlanta? And it took off. We had 60 dinners in just 6 weeks. People hosted dinners in their homes and in restaurants all across Atlanta. And we were blown away. We asked people why they participated, and they said it's because they got to meet new people outside of their usual circles. It was the first time they felt part of a meaningful conversation about Atlanta and its future. And third, it was over dinner, often at someone's home, which made it more intimate and far less intimidating. This, to me, was an aha moment. I realized that if we are to restore civility, we need 2 things. We've got to put food in front of people, and we have to have better conversations. Let's talk about food. We're actually wired to bond with people when we break bread with them. It's also a part of our daily ritual, both culturally and religiously. And when our deep needs for sustenance, community, and safety are met, we're more likely to be open to new ideas. Then second thing, we need to have better structured conversations. Conversations can go really, really wrong, like the way mine did. And to avoid this, we have to reset our intention around how we enter a conversation, away from the win-lose mentality of the past of debate, and more of a win-win, more about how we better understand one another. And the best way to do that is by letting storytelling do the hard work of building empathy and understanding. One of my favorite professors is Marshall Gans, and he teaches at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And he taught us all about that if you want to bring people along in a shared experience, you have to include 3 components: the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. And so when designing a conversation, if you start with the story of self, it's the perfect way to relate to a topic and get to know people personally. Then once people feel comfortable with one another, you can get into the harder issues, the meat of a conversation, where you can identify shared struggles, visions, and barriers. And this tension between what could be and what is now is what drives us to take action and fill that gap. And that's what leads to the third question, what we call the story of now, which is all about addressing a sense of urgency and empathetic action. So if food and conversation can help restore civility, then what are we waiting for? I felt that last year, I still wasn't ready to have my dad or my uncle over for a conversation on politics. I needed some practice first. So my husband and I decided to invite random Trump supporters over for dinner. And so we didn't know any. So we had to make a call on social media and ask our friends, explain what we were doing, and ask for their help in recruiting. And we heard crickets. Thankfully, a friend of mine invited a conservative friend of his who convinced him that I was cool and it wasn't a trap. When he showed up, he ended up bursting all of my assumptions. First, he was African American, and he was quite a big dude, and he showed up on a bicycle after biking 25 miles to my house on a hot day in Atlanta. And when he walked in, we welcomed him with open arms. He pulled out a bottle of bourbon as a welcome gift. And within 10 minutes of chatting, he'd already invited us over to his house. When we sat down for the meal, I laid out, the structure and the intent. This is not about debate, who's right or wrong. It's really about better understanding one another. And there were moments, some heated moments, where I struggled to find the words and fight back the tears. But these moments were often followed by laughter. After all, it was a dinner party. And when it came time for him to leave, I felt relieved, sad, and enlightened at the same time. When we couldn't find common ground, we were at least able to hear one another out on how we felt and why we felt that way. And it was refreshing. It was almost therapeutic. What surprised me the most was that we agreed on a lot more than we disagreed. We agreed that education system was failing, that our criminal justice system needed reform, and that our children need mentors in order to live a prosperous life. And it's in these moments when we could find common ground that real progress could be made. But conversations like this shouldn't be so hard. We have too much at stake to be wasting time and energy hating on one another. What we need to do is come together. But how do we get outside of our bubbles? That's what I'm working on. As a designer, an activist, and a civic tech entrepreneur, I believe that technology can be used for good, and that when combined with the age-old tradition of breaking bread, magical things can happen. So for the last few years, I've been working on a tech company called Civic Dinners. And our goal is to bring people together around the dinner table for conversations that matter. Our purpose is all about building a more inclusive world where everyone feels invited and engaged in co-creating a better future. And it's simple. Our approach is both high-tech and high-touch. We offer a simple structure for a meaningful conversation over food and set some ground rules. A civic host is simply a host, 6 to 10 guests, 3 big questions with equal time to share and 1 voice at a time. And our platform makes it super easy to host a dinner. And we're working on a diverse table algorithm that will help us break outside of our usual circle and match us not on our similarities, but on our differences, our different demographics, and our age and our geographies. And new features are coming that help us reduce the barriers to participation and action. So far, we've had over 1,000 civic dinners all over the world, and we've discovered that people generally want the same things. What we have in common is far more interesting than our differences. It's when we find common ground, that's where we find innovation. For example, with the Atlanta Regional Commission, when we first piloted back in 2015, we worked with the Millennial Advisory Panel where we found 8 key themes that bubbled up over the course of 35 dinners with participants. And through these themes, 12 members rallied around the theme of regional transit and ended up launching a nonprofit advocacy coalition called Advance Atlanta that helped get critical transportation referendum on the ballot in Atlanta that just passed, a $2.8 billion referendum for transit. Thank you. And 2 years ago, 2 women met at a State of Women civic dinner and shared their concerns and shared vision for a community for women. Fast forward to today, they've co-founded the Lola, a co-working space for women and a community for women. And just last year, Civic Dinners worked with Action Station in New Zealand to bring Kiwis together over food to discuss the values and visions for the future of their country. After 92 dinners, a common agenda was formed called the People's Agenda that was used to help educate voters and influence candidates running for the general election. So just imagine for a moment what we could do as a country and as a world if we could come together around the critical issues of our time. So here's my challenge to you. I dare you to host a dinner. It's so easy. It's free, and I promise you will have more faith in humanity afterwards. You can pick from a topic, and you can set up your dinner. You can set a date and a time and pick a location. You can host it at your home and make it a potluck. You can host it at your office or school and make it a brown bag civic lunch. Or you could host at your favorite restaurant and go Dutch. You could also invite your friends. Invite that colleague who just moved to town and doesn't know anyone. Invite that neighbor you've been meaning to get to know. Or invite that estranged family member you haven't talked to since the election. And then host your dinner. Just simply follow the guide. We provide you with all the questions. And for cities and regions and institutions and government agencies, we can work with you to design community conversations that help bring diverse voices to the table, raise awareness around key issues, capture valuable insights, find common ground, and help rally people around collective action, around shared vision. We as a country and global citizens realize that we face mounting challenges that are only predicted to get worse. We have a narrow window of time to come together around these critical issues. For some, these kinds of conversations can be too feel-goody, too fluffy, and maybe even snowflake material. But I beg to differ. It takes real courage to come together, face to face, and look someone in the eye with who you might disagree with and listen to their point of view. I believe this is where the real magic happens. It's kind of like when a caterpillar goes into a chrysalis to form its cocoon. It doesn't just sit there and grow wings. Things happen inside. The cells of a caterpillar break down until the entire chrysalis is one giant soup of cells. Things have to happen in the right way at the right time. One by one, imaginary cells start to turn on. And if enough imaginary cells begin to connect and find one another, they become the genetic directors, building out the framework of the wings and the body of the butterfly. And at Civic Dinners, that's what we want to do. We want to help connect, align, and awaken the next generation of civic leaders. Because that's what the world needs right now. More people who've come alive, who can connect with one another, and co-create a better future. But not every butterfly emerges from its cocoon. And if we fail to step up, if we sit on the sidelines and we stay quiet, we risk everything, including our future. A few months ago, I gave birth to this little fella, and he's awesome. He's why I've doubled down on my efforts to try to bring people together to solve the issues of our time. And he's already better at it than me. He's helped reunite me with my uncle, my aunt, and even my dad and my grandmother. And so when children and grandchildren ask us what we did during this great divide of partisan politics, what will you tell them? Will you say that you stayed silent because you just didn't want to ruffle feathers? Will you say you didn't get involved because politics isn't your thing? Or did you decide to stay in your own bubble because that's where you're more comfortable? We have a choice. We all have a choice. And I hope that you say, I helped bring people together to find common ground and co-create a better future. Thank you.